First of all, the T-shirts. I am moving on, and one of the things that I'd like to do is to pass along about 160 T-shirts that I happen to have at my home. In 2011, the Anglican Church, the diocese that funded the chaplaincy, decided to cut the chaplaincy. And a letter from the bishop of that year, 2011, suggested that the antiquated worship of the chapel was not relevant to the contemporary. So the students organized here on this campus an antiquated day, a day from start to finish having to do with all things ancient, finishing up at 12 midnight with a form of worship from the 6th century. And there was lots of Dylan. So those T-shirts, please take them, and the Dylan is on the back. And I do have an extra large for our director this year. But also for Chris Cahoon's Avon, and for Evan's Silas, and for Michelle's Stella. So. I want to sincerely thank Neil for his too generous remarks. Some of you will know that I sit at his feet at every opportunity. And I am more than honored to have been asked to deliver this lecture. I'm not an academic. I'm certainly not a philosopher. For 42 years, I have sat in FYP lectures, as you have this year. And as I am introduced to the thinking of others, I am ever discovering more about myself and thus discovering my freedom. What a privilege it has been for me to sit here. I continue to be a student, and not a good student at that. I am an original thinker only in this sense, that I get excited about the notion of seeking the first principles of reality. And I am grateful to be on that journey with others who are also seeking the origins of things. To enter into the thinking of another, be it Homer, Aeschylus, Plato, Aristotle, Anselm, Dante, Descartes, Kant, Simone Weil, is to recollect more deeply who we are. I'm quite happy to have their ideas and actual words as the furniture of my mind, insofar as they help me understand better how to love the world. Every FYP lecture I have heard since 1976 has caused that furniture to shift around, if ever so slightly. Over the years, I've also heard a number of FYP final lectures, and 3 in particular stand out for me. Robert Krauss in 1981, Henry Roper in 1998, and Stephen Burns in 2006. Each of these final FYP lectures contained a real argument. Dr. Krauss showed how the shifting views of the relation of poetry to philosophy is a dominant theme that links all the texts we study in FYP since before Socrates. And yesterday, Dr. Brandeis introduced that fascinating subject to you. Dr. Roper argued that an uncritical acceptance of postmodern thinking cannot bear the weight of Western intellectual tradition. And Dr. Burns argued that at our death there is simply nothing. He suggested how anticipation of that eternal silence is not to be feared, but embraced as precisely that which gives meaning to our lives. Well, what can I possibly contribute? I'm pretty sure that Dr. Robertson's greatest fear is that I would just talk about myself, and that is exactly what I'm going to do. In an attempt to gather together a few themes of your 5th year, I'm going to speak of my life as a very local maritime boy who became a FYP student in 1976 and has remained a local maritime boy ever since. On the one hand, there's something about the intellectual and spiritual community of kings that has profoundly affected my way of being in the world. And on the other hand, I'm just a maritime boy. Taking Augustine's Confessions as my model, I must begin my story way, way back. I'm a maritimer, born in St. John, New Brunswick, in the Salvation Army Home for Unwed Mothers. There were some 30 or so of these homes across Canada in the 1950s. Most girls, to use the language of the day, were there because of the social stigma in the 50s. Abortion was illegal. Families did not want extended family, friends, and neighbors to know about the unwed pregnant daughter. My mom was married at the time, but simply too poor to deliver a child in the hospital. Wonder if you have any idea of post-World War II urban poverty. Life certainly had an urgency about it, and it was not boring. Violence, or the threat of violence, met you around every corner, both in the home and on the street. I don't remember a lot of guns around my home, but there were a lot of knives. You would never know when a friend would come up to you on the street and simply smash you in the face with his fist, as a group watched at a distance, jumping up and down with glee. The gang had bullied him into either doing this to his friend or else having the living you-know-what kicked out of him. As David Adams Richards writes, there is no worse flaw in man's character than that of wanting to belong. I suggest also that the opposite is true, that there is no worse flaw than never wanting to belong. Nevertheless, many weekends were sweet, literally, for me, because of some of my elementary schoolmates regularly would come and stay with me. With a $2 bill, they were brown, that we would spend on hordes of penny candy, so their mums could work uninterrupted all weekend in the whorehouses across the street on Station Street. My dad was our dentist, and that when we had toothaches, which happened very often, we just had to suffer it until he eventually removed the tooth. Dentists cost money we didn't have. My dad was our barber. Don't think anything romantic in what I'm saying. I hated the hot and cold running cockroaches, getting up early in the morning for my paper route and finding the rats that had been caught in the traps overnight, having my head washed with stove oil yet again as a home remedy to get rid of head lice, and being so cold in the wintertime that a film of ice would form on the water glass beside our bed. Yes, our bed. For a number of years, there were at least 3 of us, full grown, who slept in the same bed, head to foot. Before I went to school, somehow my mom had taught me how to read, but there is nothing to read. That was a reality that followed me all the way to high school. Whenever I was tested, I would be told that I had an enormous IQ, yet because of my dismal social environment, I was well into my school years before I learned my colors, before I learned how to distinguish one color from another, the months of the year, etc. I suppose I was the only one in my elementary school that would eventually make their way to college. Through to the end of high school, I knew what a fiddle and the spoons were, but had no idea what a violin, a cello, a flute might be. So you will not be surprised when I tell you that I interpreted the world in terms of class struggle. Although my dad, with a grade 2 rural Nova Scotia education, would have supported Trump all the way, Get the thought out of your mind that he was an ignoramus. He would not have been duped by Trump, but he would have more despised the celebrity-supported middle-class entitlement oligarchy of the Democratic Party. Nor would he have been surprised at the patronizing and arrogant snobbery that suddenly was released following Trump's election, in the condescension that the American middle-class university, media, and celebrity culture has for the poor, ignorant, well-meaning, uneducated, and unenlightened underclass. You've been introduced to the Marxist analysis of history. In my youth, class struggle was the only way to make sense of the forces that shaped my reality. When I was 13 years old, I got my hands on an old shortwave radio, and I would listen every evening to Radio Moscow. In 1967 was the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. In February 1917, armed with Lenin's recently published book, State and Revolution, demonstrators clamoring for bread took to the streets in the Russian capital of Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. In November that year, the Bolsheviks seized political power. The arguments of Lenin's State and Revolution became a practical guide to Russia's working class throughout 1917 and in succeeding years. At any rate, Radio Moscow invited listeners to participate in an essay writing contest on the anniversary. I remember the title of the essay solicited. When did I first hear about Lenin and what he means to me today? I won a commemorative book of beautiful Russian stamps. Before I left high school, I became involved in organizing throughout New Brunswick the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada. Not to be confused with the historic Communist Party in Canada, founded in 1921. The Montreal-based Marxist-Leninist sided with China and rebelled against the revisionism of Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Thus, I carried with me throughout high school Mao's little red book, if you can see it there, which contains quotations from Mao. On the inside cover was the slogan, "Workers of the world, unite." In the mid-1960s, it became essentially an unofficial requirement for every Chinese citizen to own, to read, and to carry this book at all times during the great proletarian Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution lasted only 10 years until Mao died in 1976. His closest supporters were tried and convicted of treason. They were interesting times. Recollect your lecture on Marx, and you'll be able to get a flavor of the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada from how its constitution begins. The Communist Party of Canada, Marxist-Leninist, as distinguished from the revisionist Communist Party of Canada, is the political party of the proletariat. Its basic program of the Communist Party of Canada, Marxist-Leninist, is to complete the mass democratic anti-imperialist revolution, whereby the first stage toward the total overthrow of the bourgeoisie and all other exploiting classes will be accomplished, and the dictatorship of the proletariat in place of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is established, and the historic era of continuing class struggle under the dictatorship of the proletariat is inaugurated, leading to the final victory of socialism over capitalism. The ultimate aim of the party is the realization of communism. Mao thought is Marxist-Leninist of our era, in which imperialism is heading for total collapse and socialism is advancing to worldwide victory. In case you were wondering, despite my tirelessly crisscrossing the province in a classic Volkswagen van with a few other advanced members of the proletariat, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist ideology never really took hold in the backwaters of New Brunswick. But such was my world when I was finishing high school. I particularly remember the evening of 4 May 1970. 5 or 6 of us Pinkos. We were thrilled every time someone would call us Pinko commie bastards. That was the phrase used from the McCarthy era because it meant someone was paying attention, but it really didn't happen that often. Anyway, 4 or 5 of us were huddled around the radio for hours on end, hanging on every word as the news came bit by bit of the shooting of unarmed college students by members of the Ohio National Guard at Kent State University during a mass protest against the bombing of Cambodia by United States military forces. 28 guardsmen fired approximately 67 rounds over a period of 13 seconds, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. Some of you will know Neil Young's song, Ohio, composed to memorialize that event. One more thing. For some reason, it wasn't until I entered high school that I realized that people read books, cover to cover, for pleasure. I had never read a book. It never occurred to me. I had read bits of textbooks, manifestos, carried around Mao's little red book, memorized facts for tests in school, copied information out of reference books for projects. But I remember the time and place in St. John High School when I first became aware of the notion of actually reading a book. I was off to the races. I read voraciously, not at home, of course, but at the St. John Free Public Library. Everything I read confirmed the Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, materialist view of history. The dystopian novels such as George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, Huxley's Brave New World, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. I read about Malcolm X, the novel Black Like Me, the Black Panthers. As I was reading these books, I was watching on television the riots in Detroit and the Vietnam protests. The one book that was different was Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. When I came to the end of the trilogy, I simply started again. There was something different here. Not just escapism, but an actual world I wanted to inhabit. A world that I did inhabit. But then off to college, not yet to King's. At Acadia, I discovered texts that expanded my understanding of the cultural forces that had shaped me. Although I studied modern philosophy from Descartes to the 20th century Anglo-American analytic tradition, I especially discovered myself fully formed in the writings of Ludwig Feuerbach, Soren Kierkegaard, and Friedrich Nietzsche. In each, I simply recognized myself. You were very briefly introduced to Feuerbach in your lecture on Marx. One of the great surprises when I arrived in 1976 was the absence of Feuerbach in the curriculum. In the 42 years I have been a FYP student, there has never been a full lecture on Feuerbach. I consider Feuerbach to be an essential turn into the contemporary philosophical spirit, our secular culture. Now, I understand that your tutors will tell you that Feuerbach is a second-rate thinker and really not so influential for Marx and Engels and Nietzsche and Husserl, Heidegger, Buber, and certainly Karl Lovett. Well, let me just say that I disagree. A student of Hegel, Feuerbach provided the first substantial response to Hegel's claim to represent the culmination of the Western teleological philosophical tradition. He inverted and secularized the ideas of Hegel, reducing the notion of absolute spirit to human terms. Feuerbach turned idealism on its head. All theology and metaphysics became anthropology. The gods are projections of the human spirit. Feuerbach anticipates the increasing secularization of the West, suggesting in the early 1840s that the hidden truth of Christianity is finally about to be realized in the form of an atheistic humanism that renounces the fantastical consolations of religion in order to embrace the historical tasks of human self-realization in the creation of the political and cultural institutions that are conducive to it. An atheistic humanism was coming. Marx depended very much on Feuerbach for his own criticism of Hegelian philosophy. Marx insisted that of all of Hegel's students, quote, Feuerbach is the only one who has a serious, critical attitude to the Hegelian dialectic and who has made genuine discoveries in this field. He is, in fact, the one conqueror of the old philosophy. For Marx, Feuerbach rightly saw religion as a projection of the human spirit, but Marx believed that Feuerbach was unable to explain that projection in terms of the needs of humanity, alienated from itself by its social and economic structures. That is, Feuerbach did a great service in bringing the gods home to where they actually resided, in the human spirit. Marx went the next step and translated the abstract human spirit to boots on the ground. Several weeks ago, you learned how Marx concluded his work, Theses on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. But I must move along. At Acadia, I became interested in the church, and in my arrogance thought that what the church needed was to embrace enthusiastically Feuerbach's atheistic humanism as a positive affirmation of the gospel, to preach Kierkegaard's notion of faith as paradoxical and absurd, and to accept Nietzsche's critique of Christianity as a necessary correction of institutional and cultural Christianity. Alas, the bishops did not share my insights, found my interpretation of Christianity through Feuerbach, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche only perplexing, to put it mildly. At any rate, this is how I showed up at King's in 1976 and began my 42 years as a FYP student, or actually, this is how I showed up at King's in 1976. It really could be one of you, right? In fact, when I arrived, I did not know about FYP. In October of 1976, I was doing grad studies at the philosophy department at Dal and looking for a room in residence. I was interviewed by Sandy Myers at dawn of Cochrane Bay, and 10 months later, we were married. Cochrane Bay was our honeymoon suite. And here we are. And yes, I can remember our very first kiss. Think of Paolo and Francesca, Circle 2, Canto 5 of the Inferno. We did no more reading that day. What I discovered in the FYP lectures was a newfound freedom in a philosophy of history that revealed my own thinking to itself. What I discovered here is a philosophy of history that revealed my own thinking to myself. Over the years, some texts have changed, but Homer, the Greek tragic and comic poets, Plato, Aristotle, the Old Testament, Virgil, Augustine, Dante, Descartes, Kant, Nietzsche, these have all remained the staple. In its convocation address, given in 2007, on the occasion of his being made an honorary doctor, Dr. Robert Krauss said, "Recollection is the fundamental task of education. It must make what is sensibly past or hidden clear and contemporary for intellect. It must evoke the past, recent and remote, so far as possible in all its fullness and coherence, so as to make of it the nutriment of present memory, to establish thus the perspective, the substantial dimension of the present, fleeting moment. The past is always and inevitably here. And our choice is only whether to possess it consciously in recollection or to possess it in the form of unreflective prejudice, devoid of understanding." What more precise description of FYP could there be? And what better apologia could there be for FYP? There's no doubt that when I arrived at King's, I held my prejudices unreflectedly, devoid of understanding, an individual knowing no limits, compare Nietzsche, and thus tortured by the open-endedness of being. But here I was introduced to a notion of recollection, in which I discovered my own thinking. And in a critical sense, this is what FYP is all about. You have been introduced to a history of ideas, and those ideas have become your own. But FYP is more than that. The foundation year was begun in 1972 so that we might come to an understanding of our contemporary world. Your lecturers and tutors have struggled to make the past present to your reflection, not only so that you may share its intellectual achievement, but that this year of study might uncover what was both hidden to you, yet active and effectual in you. The past is always here. Our choice is to possess it consciously in recollection. But back to Thorne, the typical FYP student, the Birdman. What happened during his first years in FYP? He struggled to make sense of it all. As I was introduced to the ancient notion of a cosmos in which human beings have a well-ordered place, the criticism of that tradition in Feuerbach and in Nietzsche and in Heidegger was ever with me. In a way, I did FYP backwards. I began with the text that you ended up with. Section 6 was the lens through which I read the ancient texts for the first time. Thus, at every step along the way, from Homer to Kant, the tradition would have to be adequate to account for the alienation, the anxiety, the nothingness, the absurd, the paradoxical, the sensuous, and the affective side of human experience. I can remember reading The Republic seriously for the first time while I was visiting daily the locked adolescent unit of the local psychiatric hospital, and asking myself each day how the Platonic philosophy accounted for the highly disturbed and uncontrollably violent youth, the beautiful youth that I was befriending, and the psychopaths and the sociopaths. In every text I read, I looked to see, in the words of Feuerbach, if philosophy would, quote, come down from its divine and self-sufficient blissfulness in thought and open its eyes to human misery, unquote. Perhaps that is an unreasonable demand of the text, but nevertheless I encountered here a strand of metaphysics and approach to philosophy that did not meet that demand. Nietzsche and Heidegger continued to ring true in their critique of a certain type of philosophy that described an intellectual inward and upward ascent to the one, but left the world behind. On the other hand, neither did Nietzsche and Heidegger meet that Feuerbachian demand. Whereas Marx and Engels turned the Feuerbachian reduction of theology and metaphysics to anthropology into a historical materialism of class struggle, the turn of Nietzsche and Heidegger led to a subjectivity that did not bear a sense of responsibility for the other. Nietzsche replaces the will to truth with the will to power. Heidegger's deconstruction of subject and object and reality to that of language alone as the house of being leaves us with a vision that everything is relative. As exciting as it had been for me at a certain stage in my journey to believe that we create our own truth and meaning, it was far more liberating for me to discover my own thinking in the history of ideas. That is, to realize that my truth is not mine at all. My truth is not private. FYP caused me to reconsider what I had previously accepted in an unreflective way. Indeed, how different is the relativism of 20th century from Thrasymachus' argument in the first book of the Republic that might is right. Moral values are socially constructed, nothing but the reflection of the interests of particular political communities. And if everything is relative, on what basis can we stand even against the most radical evil of the Holocaust and the ever-increasing instances of genocide of our world? Think of the ethnic cleansing presently happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar. Think of Iceland, a country that has cleansed its nation of persons with intellectual disabilities by killing imperfect fetuses to ensure that that boy that walked across the stage here 10 minutes ago would never have been born. I hope I do not offend by expressing sheer wonderment at Heidegger's moral and intellectual blindness. So, a disembodied philosophy for the intellectual elite would never convince me. A pure subjectivity and relativism ends up in the dungeon of self. One was no better than the other. Both were equally self-indulgent. In fact, Dante would have both in his hell. Because hell for Dante is precisely that separation of knowing and loving. And then I read St. Augustine's Confessions. There in Book 7, Augustine tells us that in the books of the Platonists, he found everything. Everything except for one thing. The Word made sense. The Word made flesh. Logos, sarx. The universal Logos made particular. The transcendent made immanent. Divinity made human. Philosophy incarnated. The Word made flesh satisfied Feuerbach's demand that philosophy come down from its divine and self-sufficient blissfulness in thought and open its eyes to human misery. Our former Dean of Students, Father Nick Hatt, who's with us, lectured to you in the Council of Chalcedon in 451. That mid-5th century council used the concepts of mature Neoplatonic philosophy to describe how the divine and the human, the universal and the particular, are related. Neither is to be confused with the other. Neither is to be changed into the other. Yet, they are inseparable and indivisible from each other. Divinity and humanity come together in a single person. Here is the basis for what will become our contemporary secular world in which we live, in which the fullness of divinity dwells apart from any God language. The secular, inseparable from the sacred, but complete in itself. The secular and the sacred are unconfused. The birth of the secular is in this mid-5th century text. The incarnation, the Word made flesh, makes possible what Feuerbach calls the hidden truth of Christianity, hidden in the human, hidden in the secular. That is to be realized in the form of an atheistic humanism. See, the atheistic humanism is precisely the Christianity of Chalcedon. An atheistic humanism that embraces the historical tasks of human self-realization and the creation of the political and cultural institutions that are conducive to it. Well, long story short, when I left King's after 5 years, I took with me 3 great influences that remain to this day, my guides. And here I must present to you a puzzle. In the late 1970s, these 3 influences were not discovered here in Alumni Hall, but rather they were discovered in the common life of the intellectual and spiritual community of Kings, Simone Weil, Charles Williams, and Hannah Arendt. I'll say a few words about Charles Williams in a moment, but you know well the thought of Simone Weil and Hannah Arendt, for you have received outstanding lectures on both these thinkers by Drs. Diamond and Brandeis. As far as I know, this is the first year in the history of the foundation year program that Simone Weil has been presented in the full lecture, and Hannah Arendt has been introduced to FYP, I think, only in the past 10 years. The puzzle is simply this. 40 years ago, the foundation year program led me to take these thinkers as embodiments of the Word made flesh, of the incarnation, of a way of living authentically in the 20th century. But now these thinkers have become part of the canon of texts, not ancillary, but integral to the program itself. FYPers. How do you make sense of that? Well, whatever you might make of that, it turns out to be very convenient for me, since Drs. Diamond and Brandeis have done my heavy lifting for me in this final part of my lecture. Hannah Arendt's challenge to open ourselves to the world and to one another with sympathy, imagination, judgment, and care has continued to rest deeply with me since reading her Eichmann in Jerusalem when I was in high school. I described to you that the philosophy that I had at hand in those days was that of Karl Marx, who concluded his series of theses on Feuerbach with the words, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." During my years in FYP, that commitment shifted. Embracing the thought of Simone Weil and Hannah Arendt, I would adjust those words of Marx to read, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to love it." Recall the words of Hannah Arendt. The problem with the educated Philistine is not his or her reading the classics, but reading them with an eye to self-perfection, insulating oneself from the fragility, from the vulnerability and the suffering of others. We must take responsibility for this fragile world and all peoples, to which and to whom we must open ourselves with sympathy, imagination, judgment, and care. I need pause only very briefly to remind you of Simone Weil. I was thrilled as you were presented with the texts that have been my anchor since the late 70s. She never rejected her early commitment to the materialism of Marxism. That was the basis of her relentless, uncompromising solidarity with the poor and class struggle. Dr. Diamond highlighted Weil's great corrective to much of earlier 20th century philosophy in her exhortation to give attention to the world and to the other. Quote, "The soul empties itself of all its own content in order to receive the human being as it is looking at, just as she is, in all her truth. Only one who is capable of attention can do this. Those who are unhappy have no need for anything in this world but people capable of giving them their attention. The capacity to give attention to a sufferer is a very rare and difficult thing. It is almost a miracle. It is a miracle." Unquote. Just a word about Charles Williams in the late 1970s. One could not be here without reading Charles Williams, one of the Oxford Inklings, along with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the finest interpreters of Dante in the 20th century, who popularized the notion of the via affirmativa, the goodness of all creation. And in his notion of coherence and the doctrine of substitutionary love, Williams provided a vision of life in which we bear one another's burdens and carry one another. Not a religious doctrine, but simply the very truth of our humanity. A group of us believed Williams's teaching that through a practiced habit of giving attention to the other, type of attention that Bay talks about, we can quite literally take over the cares and anxieties of another. Williams says we can learn to bear each other's burdens just in the very same way that we learn that we can carry an actual physical parcel for another. Now, you may think that this is just another idea, but the point is, for some of us, it became the way to daily rediscover our humanity, to learn to live in one another and for one another. As Anthony of the Desert described in the 4th century, to live as though our life and our death is in our neighbor. In the chapel on this campus, this is the life we have attempted. And having mentioned the chapel, let me say a few words about exactly what Dr. Robertson said that I would talk about. How I see the relation between Alumni Hall and the chapel. And for heaven's sakes, by the chapel, I do not mean the specific Christian theurgy of ancient Christian ritual, but rather the concerts, the open mics, the retreats, the hikes, the talks, the discussions. Note, I have never made an announcement in this hall about a specifically Christian worship. That is not what the chapel is about. So just a few words about the relation between Alumni Hall and the chapel. And I shall do so by taking up the theme introduced to you yesterday, that of the ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, the subject of Dr. Krause's brilliant final FYP lecture of 1981. That quarrel between philosophy and poetry is another way of speaking of the relation of the universal, philosophy, and the particular, poetry, or the relation of knowing and loving in the human personality. In Book 10 of Plato's Republic, poetry is banished because it has the power to corrupt even the best sort of person. There's a lot of bad poetry about. But ultimately, as you know, Socrates will allow a certain type of poetry back into the Republic, namely the poetry that inspires right belief and thus can provide the beginning of the soul's ascent from belief to understanding of the forms to the good itself. Indeed, the philosopher himself must become a poet or at least an interpreter of poems, or else his reason will lead nowhere. In the Symposium, Diotima shows that love is a means of the soul's ascent. When the lover, or poet, experiences a vision of the beautiful or the good that is in accord with reason, the conclusion of the Republic is just such a philosopher's poem, the myth of error. However way you might tackle the puzzle I put to you a few moments ago, that is, why is it that the thinkers who, for the spiritual community of kings outside the FYP lecture hall in the late 70s, should now have made their way inside to become part of the canon itself, Simone Weil, Hannah Arendt, I take great consolation in this phenomenon. I suggest that it is an endorsement of the close relation between Alumni Hall and the chapel. I do find it quite remarkable that the precise passages of Simone Weil presented to you this year as her most profound contribution to the 20th century humanism have been perhaps the passages most heard in the chapel in the past 13 years. Hannah Arendt has been foundational in shaping community. The great vigil 10 days ago, the theme of my address was simply her specific call for us to take responsibility for the world and for each of us to bear its guilt. Perhaps I'm stretching it, but this indicates to me that FYP unconsciously approves of the mythopoetics of the chapel as precisely that for which there is a need in the Republic, a need in the university, not only to give initial wings to the philosopher, but also to be the mythopoetic forms that embody and carry that philosophy, the philosophy of this place. Alumni Hall and the chapel, knowing and loving, each requiring the other, unconfusedly, unchangeably, yet inseparably and indivisibly. The attention to the other of Simone Weil, the responsibility for the other of Hannah Arendt, the bearing the burdens of the other of Charles Williams. These are virtues and habits of the soul to be practiced. Simply reading about attention and responsibility and bearing burdens is not enough. Simply reading about these things is not enough. You know that. You know the constant sound bites of love, of all of these things, as this world sinks deeper and deeper into suffering. Reading about these things is not enough. Every act of atrocity, I put to you, every act of ethnic cleansing, every act of violence is somehow in somebody's mind, in the mind of the perpetrators, an act of love. Simply reading about attention, responsibility, and bearing one another's burdens is not enough. We must learn how to love. These are virtues to be practiced, cultivated, carefully honed, and lived every day. Habits to be cultivated in small communities where there's real accountability to others. Well, forgive me if I've offended. Finally, I must own up to why I began this lecture the way I did. My friend, Dr. Brandeis, again did my heavy lifting for me yesterday in addressing the issue of identity politics. The reason I began my lecture with that silly autobiographical paragraph was to try to draw a real distinction between me and you. I hope that none of you had a childhood like mine. And in case you did, I thought I was sure to offend with my reference to Trump. I was trying to create a distance. I wonder whether you pushed me away at that point. Be honest. Was there so much distance at that point that you could not give me your true attention? Did you decide that I was not worthy of your attention? Or that you were no longer responsible for my actions, since I thought so different from you? Or that you could not bear my burdens? Or that I could not bear yours? Or was it a distance at first blush that through your sympathetic imagination ended up to be no distance at all? Empathy, friendship. Every human soul is available for attention, to be embraced, to bear their burden. These are virtues and habits of the soul to be cultivated and practiced in communities. True, that's how we develop these habits in small communities. But the object of these virtues is not limited to those of your race, of your class, of your ethnic background. There are certain iterations of identity politics that are ideological evils. These are beautiful words of W.E.B. Du Bois, that challenge us to be wed with truth and to overcome ideology. In fact, this is perhaps the reading that I most identified with this year. Soul of Black Folk. I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius. And what soul I will, and they all come all graciously, with no scorn or condescension. So wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. Is this the life you grudge us, O knightly America? Is this the life you long to change into the dull red hideousness of Georgia? Are you so afraid lest peering from this high Pisgah between Philistine and Amalekite, we sight the promised land? So wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. FYP News earlier this year highlighted the life of Angus Johnson. Yesterday was the first anniversary of his death. He was a great lover and interpreter of Bob Dylan. And for Angus, I'm going to ask Karis now to sing to you the song which is misquoted on the back of your T-shirts. Without any other commentary, you either will or will not see that this is all about Simone Weil and Hannah Arendt and Charles Williams. I just have a concluding remark after the song.
The poem is on the back of the poster on your desk. Far between finished sundown and midnight's broken toll, we ducked inside the doorways, thunder went crashing as majestic bells of bolts struck shadows in the sound, seeming to be the chimes of freedom flashing for the warriors whose strength is not to fight, flashing for the refugees on the unarmed road to flight, and for each and every underdog soldier in the night that gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing. Through the city's melted furnace, unexpectedly we watched, with faces hidden as the walls were tightening, as the echo of the wedding bells before the blowing rain dissolved into the bells of lightning. sky cracked its palms in naked warmth, that the clinging of the church bells blew far into the breeze, leaving only bells of lightning and its thunder, striking for the gentle, striking for the kind, striking for the guardians and protectors of the mind, and the poet and the painter far behind his rightful time, and we gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing in the wild cathedral evening. The rain unraveled tales for the disrobed, faceless forms of no position, tolling for the tongues with no place to bring their thoughts, all down in taken for granted situations, tolling for the deaf and blind, tolling for the mute and the mistreated maidless mother, the mistitled prostitute, for the misdemeanor outlaw, chained and cheated by pursuit, and we gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing. Even though a cloud's white curtain in a far-off corner flashed, and the hypnotic splattered mist was slowly lifting, electric lights still struck like arrows, fired but for the ones condemned to drift, or else to keep from drifting, tolling for the searching ones on their speechless seeking trail, for the lonesome-hearted lovers with too personal a tale, and for each unharmful gentle soul misplaced inside a jail, and we gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing. Starry-eyed and laughing, I recall when we were caught, trapped by no track of ours, for they hang suspended. As we listen one last time, and we watch with one last look, spellbound and swallowed till the tolling ended, tolling for the aching ones whose wounds cannot be nursed, for the countless confused, accused, misused, strung out ones and worse, and for every hung-up person in this whole wide universe, and we gazed upon the chimes of freedom flashing.
Thank you, Karis. I sincerely hope that this silly presentation of my journey has somehow managed to tie together some themes from this year. I haven't spoken of friendship. I don't think I need to. When I look at you, I see friendship. I see friendship of all sorts and types, and I see my friends. Final word, the Frippers. I want you to know how beautiful you are to me. The Chaplain Search Committee interviewed me and asked what I would describe to be the one indispensable quality of a new chaplain. And I said that he or she be open to his or her conversion by you, by the students of this college, by your beauty and your truth and your goodness. That the incoming chaplains see it as his task to help you see, himself see, the sun around which you revolve, the sun that gives us all light in the darkness. I don't know, said Frodo. It came to me then as if I was making it up, but I may have heard it long ago. Certainly it reminds me very much of Bilbo in the last years before he went away. He used often to say that there was only one road, but it was like a great river. Its springs were at every doorstep, and every path was its tributary. It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out of your door, he used to say. You step into the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you'll be swept off to. Do you realize that this is the very path that goes through Mirkwood, and that if you let it, it might take you to the Lonely Mountain or even farther into worse places? He used to say that on the path outside the front door at Bag End, especially after he had been out for a long walk. A beautiful passage from the Fellowship of the Rings is often quoted, but not in full. It usually concludes with the feel-good part. There's no telling where you'll be swept off to. It doesn't continue to. Do you realize that this is the very path that goes through Mirkwood? And that if you let it, it might take you to the Lonely Mountain or even farther and to worse places? Mirkwood, some of you probably know, Tolkien insisted, was not a made-up place, but is mentioned in the 13th century Icelandic manuscript, the Codex Regius, as that, quote, dark boundary forest, that great forest that divided the land of the Goths from the land of the Huns, unquote. It was a place of fear. And so do I wish you to step on the road and be swept off to places of fear and loneliness and worse? Yes. That's why this college exists. In this college, you have been introduced to the unity of knowing and loving. And that is what this world needs. Love casteth out fear. Love is not a soundbite. It's a fearful and lonely place for so many. Find a small community that practices the giving of attention, the willful taking on the guilt of the whole world, and the bearing of one another's burdens. And then dare to step into the road, be swept off your feet to Mirkwood, the Lonely Mountain, and to worse places. This college has prepared you for this, for the sake of the world. Be true to your calling. Thank you.